Everyone expected the Shadow Lord to choose the village's most conventionally beautiful maiden. Instead, he was drawn to the curvy librarian, who challenged his mind, healed his ancient wounds, and showed him what true strength looked like. Their love story would redefine everything both their worlds believed about beauty and worth. The morning light, filtering through the tall windows of Thornwick's library, cast golden rectangles across the worn wooden floors, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. Clara Whitmore moved between the towering bookshelves with the quiet grace of someone who had found sanctuary among stories, her full figure draped in a simple brown dress that she'd sewn herself. Practical, modest, designed to draw as little attention as possible. At 25, Clara had long since accepted her role as the village's spinster librarian. While other women her age had married and started families, she had devoted herself to the care of books and the occasional patron who wandered into her domain, seeking knowledge or escape. It was a peaceful existence, if lonely, and she had convinced herself it was enough. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world lay still and her defenses were down, Clara allowed herself to dream. She dreamed of adventures beyond the familiar confines of Thornwick, of intellectual conversations that lasted deep into the night, of someone who would truly see her for who she was beneath the surface. The library had been her refuge since childhood. After her parents died in the fever outbreak 12 years ago, leaving her with nothing but the collection they had built together, Clara had thrown herself into her work with desperate intensity. Books didn't judge, stories didn't whisper cruel assessments behind her back. Between these leather-bound covers, she was safe from the world's casual cruelties. Her father, scholar Edmund Whitmore, had been a learned man who believed knowledge belonged to everyone, regardless of station or circumstance. He had built the library not just as a repository of books, but as a beacon of learning in a rural community that often valued practical skills over intellectual pursuits. Her mother, Isabel, had been the one with the gentle touch who could coax even the most reluctant readers into discovering the joy of stories. Clara had inherited her father's scholarly mind and her mother's nurturing spirit, but she sometimes wondered if she had also inherited their tendency toward isolation. Her parents had been devoted to their work and to each other, but they had never quite fitted into the social fabric of Thornwick. Perhaps that's where Clara's own struggles with belonging had begun. "Miss Whitmore," came a voice from the library's entrance, causing Clara to look up from the ledger where she was recording new acquisitions. The familiar mixture of hope and trepidation that accompanied any interruption to her routine flickered through her chest. Young Timothy Fletcher stood in the doorway, clutching a copy of Tales of Ancient Magic with obvious reluctance. At 14, he was caught between childhood wonder and the growing pressure to conform to what the village expected of a blacksmith's son. His dark hair was mussed from work, and his hands bore the telltale smudges of coal and iron that marked his trade. Clara had been watching Timothy's intellectual development with a mixture of pride and concern. The boy possessed a sharp mind that hungered for knowledge beyond the practical skills his family trade demanded. She had seen this pattern before, bright young people gradually dimming their curiosity to fit society's narrow expectations. "Did you enjoy it?" Clara asked gently, noting the careful way he held the book, as if it contained precious secrets that he was reluctant to surrender. Timothy glanced over his shoulder to ensure no one was listening, then nodded eagerly. His eyes, bright blue like his father's, sparkled with the kind of intellectual curiosity that Clara recognized and cherished. "The story about the Shadow Realm," he said in a hushed voice, "the part where the scholar discovers that our world is just one layer of reality. Is it really just fiction?" Clara's smile was knowing and warm. She had been fielding such questions for years, watching as the village's young people gravitated toward tales of magic and adventure, while their parents insisted such stories were nonsense, time-wasting diversions from practical concerns. This was the part of her work that truly mattered, nurturing young minds, encouraging curiosity, planting seeds of wonder that might one day bloom into something extraordinary. "What do you think, Timothy?" she replied, employing the Socratic method that had served her well in encouraging critical thinking. Her father had taught her this approach, believing that the best teachers didn't provide answers, but helped students discover them for themselves. I think he hesitated, then squared his shoulders with adolescent determination. I think there are more things in the world than this village knows about. Sometimes when I'm working the forge late at night, I swear I see things moving in the shadows that shouldn't be there. And the old stories, they're too consistent across different cultures and time periods to be completely made up. A wise observation. Clara accepted the book, noting the care with which Timothy had handled it. Not a single page was bent or marked, despite his obvious enthusiasm for the contents. There's a new volume that just arrived from the capital, Chronicles of the Northern Kingdoms. It has some fascinating accounts of unusual phenomena in the mountain regions, documented by scholars who approached the supernatural with scientific rigor. Timothy's eyes lit up with excitement, but the brightness quickly dimmed as reality intruded. Mother says I'm not to fill my head with such nonsense anymore. Says it's time I focused on practical matters, on learning the trade properly so I can take over the smithy someday. Clara felt the familiar pang of frustration that came with watching curious minds being stifled by narrow thinking. She had seen it happen countless times. Intelligent young people gradually losing their sense of wonder as the weight of practical expectations settled upon their shoulders. How many potential scholars, inventors, and visionaries had been lost to the tyranny of practical thinking? How many minds, capable of extraordinary insights, had been dulled by the insistence that curiosity was a luxury they couldn't afford? Knowledge is always practical, Timothy, she said carefully, choosing her words to plant seeds of resistance against the intellectual conformity that threatened to claim another bright mind. Even the stories we call fiction can teach us truths about courage, wisdom, and the strength we didn't know we possessed. The human imagination doesn't create randomly. It draws upon deep truths about the nature of reality, even when we don't consciously understand what we're tapping into. The boy nodded solemnly, understanding passing between them. It was a conversation Clara had experienced many times. The hunger for something beyond the mundane, the sense that the world held mysteries worth exploring, the gradual crushing of wonder under the weight of societal expectation. Could you? Timothy glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. Could you perhaps keep that new book aside for me? I might find time to read it when Mother isn't watching so closely. Clara's heart ached for the necessity of intellectual rebellion that drove a 14-year-old to pursue knowledge in secret. Of course, I'll make sure it's available whenever you can safely visit. After Timothy left, Clara returned to her work, but the familiar melancholy had settled over her like a well-worn cloak. Through the window, she could see the village square, where life continued its predictable rhythm. Merchants hawked their wares with practiced calls. Children played between the stalls with infectious laughter, and young couples walked arm in arm, their future happiness seemingly assured. She had stopped dreaming of such companionship years ago. The whispers had made sure of that. The cruel words echoed in her memory with the persistence of a recurring nightmare. Just last week, she had heard Mrs. Ashford murmuring to her companion at the market, their voices carrying the particular tone that people used when they believed themselves unobserved. Poor Clara, the older woman had said with full sympathy. Such a pretty face. If only she'd lose the weight. No man wants a wife he can't get his arms around. And at her age, with her circumstances, well, she's missed her chance, hasn't she? The comments stung because they echoed the doubts that lived in her own mind, the voice that whispered that she was too much in some ways and not enough in others. She had tried, over the years, to make herself smaller, eating less, wearing darker colors, taking up less space in every way possible. But her body seemed determined to maintain its soft curves, despite her efforts, and eventually, she had simply learned to accept the isolation that came with being different. But acceptance, she was learning, was not the same as peace. And sometimes, in the quiet hours between dawn and daybreak, she wondered if there was more to existence than simply enduring. The morning passed quietly, marked by the familiar routine of organizing returned books, updating catalog entries, and preparing for the few patrons who might venture in during the afternoon. Clara had just finished dusting the historical section when she noticed something unusual about one of the volumes, a book she didn't remember acquiring. The Veiled Histories of the Northern Realms bore no library stamp, no record of purchase or donation. The leather binding was aged but well maintained, and when Clara opened it, she found hand-illuminated pages filled with accounts of supernatural encounters that made her pulse quicken with scholarly excitement. Where had this book come from? And why did reading its contents feel less like discovery and more like remembering? The text described shadow creatures with an accuracy that went far beyond folklore or imagination. Every detail matched accounts she had read in other sources, but this volume contained information she had never encountered before: weaknesses, behavioral patterns, methods of summoning, and banishment that read more like scientific observation than mythological speculation. Clara was so absorbed in the mysterious book that she almost missed the unusual commotion developing in the square outside. Through the window, she could see people backing away from something, their faces pale, with a mixture of fear and fascination that spoke of an event outside their normal experience. A stranger had arrived in Thornwick, and judging by the reaction, he was no ordinary traveler. Clara's curiosity overcame her usual caution. Setting down the mysterious book, she moved to the window for a better view, her academic mind immediately engaged by the puzzle of what could cause such a dramatic response from her normally unflappable neighbors. The man standing in the center of the square was unlike anyone she had ever seen. Tall and lean, dressed in black clothing that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, he carried himself with an authority that made even the boldest villagers step aside. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that held depth Clara couldn't fathom from her distant perch. But it was the way he moved that truly captured her attention. Every gesture was controlled, deliberate, as if he was constantly aware of his own power and the effect it had on others. When he spoke to the village elder, his voice carried clearly across the square, despite its measured tone, and Clara found herself straining to catch every word. "I seek lodging for the night," he said, and even from her window, Clara could hear the subtle accent that marked him as someone from far beyond their small corner of the world. There was something else in his voice too, an undertone of command that suggested he was accustomed to having his requests treated as imperatives. "The inn, my lord," stammered Elder Morrison, though Clara noted he used the honorific without knowing the stranger's true station. Something about the man's bearing demanded such respect, as if nobility radiated from him like heat from a forge. "The Golden Swan, Martha keeps clean rooms and serves good food." The stranger's gaze swept across the village, taking in details with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to assessing potential threats or advantages. His eyes moved like those of a predator, missing nothing, cataloging everything. When his gaze passed over the library, Clara stepped back instinctively, though she doubted he could see her through the glass at such a distance. Yet, for a moment, she could have sworn those dark eyes had found her, assessed her, and filed her away as something interesting. "I also require information," the stranger continued, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the square with effortless authority. "I'm told this village has extensive records of local history and folklore." Elder Morrison's face brightened with the relief of someone who had found solid ground in an uncomfortable conversation.
"Oh, yes.
"My lord, our librarian, Miss Whitmore, maintains the finest collection in 3 counties. Very knowledgeable she is, though." He paused, apparently realizing he was about to comment on Clara's unmarried state to a stranger whose reaction was impossible to predict. Though what? The question held an edge that made Morrison shift nervously, his confidence evaporating under the stranger's unwavering stare. "Nothing of import, my lord," Morrison said quickly, backpedaling from whatever observation he had been about to make. "I'm sure she'll be most helpful with whatever information you require." Clara felt her heart begin to race as she realized he was coming here, to her sanctuary, to seek her expertise. The stranger nodded curtly and turned toward the library, his purposeful stride sending the remaining gawkers scattering like leaves before a wind. Clara watched his approach with a mixture of anticipation and terror, her mind racing through all the possible reasons why such an imposing figure might need her help. In all her years as librarian, she had never entertained such a visitor. Most of her patrons were locals, seeking specific information, or the occasional traveling scholar, researching obscure topics. None had ever commanded such attention or inspired such obvious unease in the usually confident village leadership, and none had ever made her feel quite so aware of her own heartbeat. Clara quickly moved away from the window, smoothing her skirts and checking her appearance in the small mirror behind her desk. Her reflection showed a round face with intelligent green eyes, chestnut hair pulled back in a simple bun, and the soft curves that had marked her as different from the village's ideal of feminine beauty. She had long ago stopped trying to hide what she was, but the approaching encounter made her acutely conscious of how she might appear to sophisticated eyes. The library door opened with its familiar creak, and suddenly the spacious room felt small and timid. The stranger's presence seemed to fill every corner, making Clara acutely aware of her own body, her nervousness, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her. Up close, he was even more striking than he had appeared from the window. His features were sharp and aristocratic, with the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of noble breeding. His skin was pale, almost luminous in the library's golden light, and his eyes glowed. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, dark and deep and filled with secrets. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful, like a blade that could cut you even as you admired its craftsmanship. Miss Whitmore? His voice was rich and cultured, carrying hints of education and refinement that made Clara's scholarly heart skip a beat. The way he said her name, with careful precision and a hint of old-world formality, suggested he was accustomed to speaking multiple languages. Yes, I'm Clara Whitmore. She was proud that her voice remained steady, professional, though her pulse was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. How may I assist you? He stepped further into the library, his dark eyes taking in the careful organization, the lovingly maintained volumes, the small personal touches that marked this as more than just a repository of books. It was clearly someone's passion project, a life's work built on love rather than mere duty. His gaze lingered on details that others might miss, the fresh flowers on her desk, the careful repair work on damaged spines, the way the afternoon light revealed her system of color-coded organization. I am Lord Aldric Rivencrest, he said, offering a slight bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and commanding. The gesture was perfectly executed. Speaking of formal training in courtly manners, I'm researching local legends, particularly those concerning supernatural phenomena in the surrounding countryside. Clara felt a flutter of excitement that had nothing to do with the man's imposing presence and everything to do with his request. This was her domain, her area of expertise, the subject that had fascinated her since childhood. The nervous energy that had been building since she first saw him in the square transformed into intellectual eagerness. Finally, someone who might appreciate the work she had dedicated her life to, someone who understood that knowledge was a living thing, worthy of pursuit and preservation. We have extensive records, she said, moving toward the section where she kept her most prized volumes. Her step was surer now, confidence returning as she entered familiar territory. Local histories dating back 3 centuries, collected folklore, even some first-hand accounts of unusual events. What particular type of phenomena are you investigating? Reports of shadow creatures, Lord Ravencrest replied, following her deeper into the library. His movement was predatory grace incarnate, silent and fluid, as if he had learned to walk without disturbing even the dust motes in the air. Beings that exist partially in our world and partially somewhere else. There have been sightings throughout the Northern Territories, and I'm attempting to trace their origins. Clara paused, her hand hovering over a leather-bound volume that she rarely shared with casual researchers. The mysterious book she had discovered that morning seemed to pulse with relevance, but she hesitated to mention it until she understood more about this enigmatic visitor. "The Chronicles of Darkness," she said quietly, her voice carrying the reverence due to a text she considered among her most valuable possessions. Written by Brother Marcus in he documented dozens of encounters with shadow beings, including detailed descriptions of their behavior and apparent purposes. This was the moment of truth. Would he dismiss her knowledge as folklore and superstition, or would he prove to be someone who understood that wisdom could be found in unexpected places? "You're familiar with the work?" There was something new in his voice, surprise perhaps or approval. "I've studied every account we have," Clara admitted, pulling the book from its place and handling it with the reverence due to a precious artifact. The leather binding was worn smooth by countless careful handlings, and the pages within contained insights that most modern scholars would dismiss as medieval nonsense. Most dismiss them as folklore, but the consistency of the descriptions across different time periods and locations suggests something more substantial. Lord Ravencrest moved closer, close enough that Clara could catch the subtle scent of bergamot and something wilder, like winter forests and storm-darkened skies. When he reached for the book, his fingers brushed against hers, and she felt an unexpected jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with scholarly excitement. His skin was cold, she noticed. Not unpleasantly so, but noticeably cooler than normal human temperature. And when she looked closely, she could see that his pale skin had an almost translucent quality, as if light passed through rather than reflecting off its surface. "You believe their accounts are genuine?" he asked, seemingly unaware of the effect his proximity was having on her nervous system. "I believe," Clara said carefully, her academic training asserting itself, even as her personal awareness of him threatened to overwhelm her professional demeanor, that dismissing something simply because we don't understand it is the height of intellectual arrogance. Something shifted in Lord Ravencrest's expression, surprise perhaps, or appreciation. The change was subtle but unmistakable, as if she had passed some kind of test he hadn't expected her to pass. "An interesting perspective, Miss Whitmore, and a refreshingly scholarly approach." His approval sent warmth blooming through Clara's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to remember. When was the last time someone had complimented her mind rather than offering backhanded comments about her appearance? When had anyone last looked at her as if her thoughts and opinions held genuine value? "Would you like me to gather the related materials?" she offered, surprised by her own boldness. "There are several volumes that might interest you, plus some loose documents that haven't been formally catalogued yet." And she hesitated, then decided to trust her instincts. "There's something else, a book that appeared in my collection this morning. I have no record of how it arrived, but it contains the most detailed accounts of shadow creatures I've ever encountered. I would be most grateful." The formal phrasing didn't hide the genuine warmth in his voice. As Clara moved through the library, collecting books and manuscripts, she was intensely aware of Lord Ravencrest watching her. Not the judgmental observation she was accustomed to receiving from villagers, but something more thoughtful, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle she represented. There was something different about the way he looked at her, not the clinical assessment she was used to, not the barely concealed pity or amusement, but something that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. She retrieved the mysterious volume from her desk, noting how it seemed to warm at her touch. "This is the book I mentioned," she said, setting it carefully on the reading table alongside the other texts. "I've never seen anything quite like it. The level of detail, the accuracy of observation, it reads less like folklore and more like scientific documentation." Lord Ravencrest's eyes sharpened as he examined the book, and Clara could have sworn she saw recognition flicker across his features. "Where did you say this came from?" "I didn't, because I truly don't know. It simply appeared. When I opened the library this morning, it was sitting on my desk, as if it had always belonged there." Clara watched his reaction carefully. "You recognize it?" "The binding style is familiar," he said carefully. "It's quite old, 14th century, I would estimate. And you're right about the quality of documentation. Whoever wrote this had extensive personal experience with the subjects discussed." "You've lived here long?" he asked. as she set a stack of additional volumes on the reading table. All my life, my parents established the library, and I inherited both the collection and the position. Clara gestured to the shelves around them, her voice carrying pride despite the modest scope of her domain. It's a small world, but it contains multitudes. You quote Whitman. His observation carried a note of pleased surprise. You recognize Whitman? But it wasn't quite a question, more an expression of gratified recognition. How rare it was to find someone who could identify such references, who moved in the same intellectual circles that she inhabited through her reading, if not through personal experience. I contain multitudes myself, Miss Whitmore, some of them quite dark. There was something in his tone that made Clara look at him more closely, something that suggested depths and experiences that went far beyond the normal scope of human existence. In the afternoon light, she could see that his pale skin had an almost ethereal quality, and his eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no mortal should have endured. There was an otherworldly beauty to him that was becoming more apparent the longer she looked. Too perfect, too still, too carefully controlled. And yet, instead of being frightened by these observations, Clara found herself intrigued. Her academic mind was already cataloguing details, forming hypotheses, eager to understand rather than judge. We all have darkness within us, she said quietly, her words carrying more weight than their simple phrasing might suggest. The question is what we choose to do with it. And what would you do with it if you discovered that someone you had come to respect harbored secrets that defied natural law? His question was clearly a test, though Clara couldn't yet understand what he was testing for. Clara considered the question seriously, aware that something important hinged on her answer. This wasn't academic speculation. There was too much tension in his posture, too much careful attention to her response for this to be mere intellectual exercise. I suppose I would try to understand. Knowledge has always been more valuable to me than judgment. She met his gaze directly, allowing him to see the sincerity in her response. The unknown shouldn't be feared simply because it's unknown. It should be studied, comprehended, appreciated for what it might teach us about the true nature of reality, even if that knowledge came with danger. Especially then. Clara's smile was soft but determined, revealing a core of steel beneath her gentle exterior. The most important truths are often the most dangerous ones. If they weren't dangerous, everyone would already know them. Lord Ravencrest studied her for a long moment, and Clara had the distinct impression that she had just passed some kind of crucial examination, though she wasn't certain what the stakes had been. What she didn't know was that she had just proven herself to be exactly what he had been searching for. Not just an expert in supernatural folklore, but someone with the intellectual courage to accept truths that would shatter most people's understanding of reality. Miss Wetmore, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been relief. I believe you may be exactly what I've been searching for. A librarian? Her attempt at lightness couldn't quite hide the flutter of hope his words had inspired. A scholar, a woman of intelligence and courage, who sees beyond surface appearances to the truths that matter. His smile was slight, but genuine, transforming his entire face from imposing to almost approachable. Someone who understands that the world holds more mysteries than most people dare to acknowledge. Clara felt her heart racing again, but this time, it wasn't from nervousness. For the first time in years, someone was seeing her, not her size, not her unmarried status, not her role as a village's odd spinster, but her mind, her courage, her willingness to embrace the unknown. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The afternoon hours that followed passed more quickly than Clara had ever experienced, lost in discussion of historical accounts, legendary creatures, and the thin places where reality bent to accommodate impossibility. She forgot to be self-conscious about her appearance or status. Lord Ravencrest proved to be exactly the kind of intellectual companion she had dreamed of, but never expected to find. Well-read, thoughtful, willing to consider ideas that others would dismiss as fantasy. As they worked, Clara found herself stealing glances at him, admiring the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he held books as if they were precious objects, the graceful movements of his pale hands as he turned pages or made notes in a leather journal. The patterns are fascinating, Clara said, comparing entries from different volumes spread across the reading table. Her earlier nervousness had completely disappeared, replaced by the focused intensity that always overtook her when she was deep in scholarly work. The shadow creatures appear in cycles, long periods of absence, followed by sudden increases in activity, almost as if something calls them forth. Or someone, Lord Ravencrest murmured, studying a map where Clara had marked reported sightings with different colored pins. His attention to detail was remarkable, and Clara found herself impressed by the depth of his analytical thinking. What do you notice about the geographical distribution? Clara traced the marked locations with her finger, her mind automatically organizing the data into patterns and possibilities. This was what she lived for, the moment when disparate pieces of information began to coalesce into understanding. They clustered around areas with strong historical significance, ancient battlegrounds, sites of old castles, places where she paused, a realization dawning that made her pulse quicken with excitement. Where what? He prompted, leaning closer to study her work. Where the barrier between worlds might be naturally thin. Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright with discovery. Lord Ravencrest, what if these creatures aren't invading our world? What if they're being pulled into it? His dark eyes sharpened with interest, and Clara felt a thrill at having earned his intellectual respect. Elaborate. Every culture has legends of threshold places, locations where the supernatural can cross into our reality. Standing stones, ancient groves, places where significant events have worn the fabric of the world thin. Clara's voice gained confidence as her theory took shape. What if increased shadow activity indicates that something in our world is drawing them forth, creating a kind of magical resonance? You think like a scholar, he observed, and Clara felt that now familiar warmth at his approval. It was intoxicating to have her mind appreciated so openly, to feel valued for her intelligence rather than judged for her appearance. Most people see only the surface of such phenomena, she replied, surprised by her own boldness. They want simple explanations for complex realities. No, he said softly, his gaze intense as it rested on her face. I imagine you haven't. Something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. In the lamplight, his features seemed both sharper and softer somehow, as if the gathering darkness revealed aspects of him that daylight concealed. The mysterious book lay open between them, its illuminated pages casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering candlelight. Lord Ravencrest, she said carefully, her scholarly mind already cataloguing anomalies. May I ask what your personal interest is in this research? He was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if he was choosing each one with great care. Let's say that I have personal experience with the subjects we're discussing. You've encountered shadow creatures, among other things. He met her gaze directly, and Clara saw something flicker in those dark depths. Vulnerability, perhaps, or the weight of secrets too heavy for one person to carry. Miss Whitmore, if I were to tell you that the world is far stranger than most people believe, that creatures of legend walk among us, that the line between reality and fantasy is much thinner than your neighbors imagine, what would you say? Clara considered the question seriously, her academic training warring with the growing certainty that this conversation was far more than theoretical. Everything about Lord Ravencrest suggested depths that went beyond normal human experience. His stillness, his pale perfection, the way he moved like a predator even when at rest. The mysterious book seemed to pulse with relevance, its pages filled with detailed observations that could only have come from direct experience, and Lord Ravencrest's reaction to it, recognition, familiarity, the careful way he had avoided touching it directly. I would say that I've suspected as much for years, she replied honestly. The consistency of supernatural accounts across cultures and centuries suggests underlying truth, even if the details vary. And you, she paused, studying his face with the same analytical attention she applied to her research. You're not entirely human, are you? Instead of denying it or seeming surprised by her perceptiveness, Lord Ravencrest smiled, the first truly genuine expression she had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, making him seem less marble statue and more flesh and blood. Most people don't notice such things. Most people don't want to notice. They prefer their world predictable and comfortable. Clara leaned forward slightly, her curiosity overcoming any fear she might have felt. But I've never been most people. No, he agreed, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration. You certainly haven't. So what are you exactly? Something that exists in the shadows between life and death. Something that has walked this world for longer than you might expect. Something that feeds on, he hesitated, as if even he wasn't certain how much truth she could handle. On what? It's complicated. Clara laughed, surprising them both with a sound. The laughter was genuine, delighted, completely without fear, and Lord Ravencrest looked at her as if she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever encountered. Lord Ravencrest, I've just deduced that you're some form of supernatural being, and I'm sitting here calmly discussing it with you instead of running away screaming. I think I can handle complicated. You're remarkable, he said quietly, and Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest at the obvious sincerity in his voice. I am practical and curious, two qualities that serve me well when dealing with the impossible. Clara settled back in her chair, her posture relaxed despite the earth-shattering nature of their conversation. Now, are you going to tell me what you are, or shall I guess? By all means, guess. Clara studied him with the same systematic attention she applied to her research, cataloging details and drawing logical conclusions. Pale skin that seems almost translucent, unusual stillness. I haven't seen you breathe normally since you arrived. You move like a predator, with perfect balance and control. Your knowledge spans centuries rather than decades. You're strongest after dark. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. Vampire. Very good. Was I right? Close enough. Lord Ravencrest, though Clara suspected that wasn't his real name, leaned back in his chair, his posture suggesting relief at having the truth acknowledged. I'm impressed. Most humans either refuse to see the truth or react with hysteria when they do. I'm not most humans. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing this confirmation of what she had suspected. The revelation should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of completion, as if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Are you here to hurt someone? No. Are you here to hurt me? Quite the opposite. His expression grew serious, and Clara could see the weight of genuine concern in his features. I'm here because I need help, and I believe you may be one of the few people capable of providing it. What kind of help? The shadow creatures we've been researching. They're not random phenomena. Someone is summoning them, controlling them, using them for purposes that threaten both the supernatural and human worlds. His hands clenched into fists, and Clara caught a glimpse of the rage that simmered beneath his controlled exterior. Who would do such a thing? Someone with considerable power and questionable intentions. Someone who sees mortals as expendable resources and supernatural beings as tools to be controlled. His voice carried bitter knowledge, the pain of betrayal, long nursed but never forgotten. Someone I once trusted. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The implications of what he was telling her began to sink in, not just the existence of supernatural beings, but the presence of someone actively malevolent, someone who threatened both worlds. She was beginning to understand. And you need my help to stop them? I need your mind, your research skills, your understanding of local history and folklore. The summoner is operating from somewhere in this region, using sites of power that would be documented in historical records. He gestured to the volumes spread between them, the kind of records I maintain. Exactly. Clara was quiet for a long moment, aware that she stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of her existence. She could decline, send Lord Ravencrest on his way, and return to her safe, predictable life among books and familiar routines, or she could step into the unknown, helping a vampire investigate supernatural threats that most people didn't even believe existed. When she really considered it, there was no choice at all. "What do you need me to do?" Relief flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been gratitude. "Help me identify locations where someone might establish a base of operations for summoning shadow creatures, places with the right combination of isolation, historical significance, and natural power." "I can do that." Clara moved to a cabinet where she kept her most detailed maps and surveys, her mind already racing through possibilities. "Though I should warn you, this kind of research could take days. I have time. And I should also warn you that working with me will attract attention from the village. They're already gossiping about your presence, and if you're seen spending extended time with the spinster librarian." She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious about the reality of their situation. "Let them gossip." His tone was dismissive, carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested he had never concerned himself with the opinions of lesser beings. "Their opinions matter less than nothing to me. They might matter to you if you're trying to maintain a low profile." "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising to help her spread a large map across the table, "I stopped caring about the opinions of small-minded people decades ago. Besides," he added with a slight smile that made Clara's heart skip, "any man would be honored to be associated with a woman of your intelligence and character." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment, even as part of her mind whispered that he was probably just being kind. Years of conditioning were hard to overcome, and the voice that told her she was unworthy of such regard was persistent. "You don't have to say things like that," she said quietly, focusing on the map to avoid meeting his eyes. "Say things like what?" "Complimentary things about my character and intelligence. I know what I look like, Lord Ravencrest. I know how people see me." He moved around the table until he stood close enough to touch her, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. When he spoke, his voice was firm, almost stern in its conviction. "Miss Whitmore, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his, expecting to see pity or polite kindness. Instead, she found something that took her breath away, genuine admiration, warmth, and an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced. "You are a beautiful woman," he said firmly, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Not despite your curves, but including them. You carry yourself with grace and dignity that puts so-called beauties to shame. Your face is lovely, your eyes are intelligent and kind, and your mind is extraordinary." His voice gentled without losing its certainty. "Anyone who can't see that is blind to what actually matters." Clara felt tears threaten again, her throat tight with emotion she didn't know how to process. "You don't understand what it's like to be judged by superficial standards, to be dismissed because you don't fit narrow definitions of acceptability, to be valued for the wrong things and criticized for the right ones." His smile was rueful, carrying its own weight of experience. "Miss Whitmore, I assure you that I understand such things better than you might expect." "But you're—" Clara stopped herself, unwilling to voice the comparison that would only highlight the differences between them. "What?" "Nothing. Please, speak freely. You're magnificent," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Powerful, sophisticated, handsome. You could have anyone you wanted." "Could I? And what if what I want is a woman who values knowledge over gossip, who shows courage in the face of the unknown, who treats even supernatural beings with kindness and respect?" He moved closer still, close enough that Clara could feel the coolness radiating from his skin. "What if I want someone who sees past surfaces to the person beneath?" Clara's heart was beating so fast, she was certain he could hear it, and given his supernatural nature, he probably could. "Lord Ravencrest, Aldric," he corrected softly, "and I meant every word I just said." The library seemed to hold its breath around them, dust motes suspended in golden lamplight, like tiny witnesses to a moment that would change everything. Clara found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something deeper than physical attraction, a recognition of kindred spirits, of two souls who had spent too long in isolation. Before she could lose her nerve or overthink what was happening, Clara reached up and touched his face gently. His skin was indeed cool, but it warmed under her fingertips, and when he closed his eyes at her touch, she saw vulnerability that made her heart ache. "Aldric," she whispered, testing the name on her lips. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me, really seeing me." Her thumb traced the sharp line of his cheekbone. "I've spent so many years believing I was invisible, that I didn't matter. You make me feel valuable." "You are valuable," he said fiercely, his eyes opening to meet hers. "You're extraordinary, Clara. More than extraordinary. You're exactly what I've been searching for without knowing it." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and the weight of two lonely souls recognizing each other. Clara felt as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to step into a life she had never dared imagine for herself. Before either of them could speak again, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see torchlight moving through the village square, and the sound of agitated voices carried on the night air. The peaceful afternoon had given way to evening without Clara noticing, so absorbed had she been in their conversation. "What's happening?" Clara moved to the window, Aldric close behind her. "I'm not sure." His expression had grown grim, and Clara could sense his supernatural senses reaching out to assess the situation. "But I suspect our research may have become more urgent than we realized." As they watched, a group of villagers gathered around Elder Morrison, their faces pale with fear in the torchlight. Whatever they were discussing had clearly frightened them badly, and Clara felt a foreboding that made her skin prickle. "Stay here," Aldrich instructed, moving toward the door with predatory purpose. "Absolutely not." Clara was already reaching for her cloak, her earlier passivity replaced by newfound determination. "If this relates to your shadow creatures, then you need my local knowledge. It could be dangerous. Then you'll need all the help you can get." Clara wrapped her cloak around her shoulders with determined movements, her chin set in a way that suggested argument would be futile. "Besides, I'm tired of watching life happen from behind windows. If there's something threatening my village, I want to know about it." Aldrich studied her for a moment, and Clara saw what might have been approval flicker in his dark eyes. "Very well, but stay close to me, and if I tell you to run, don't argue." "Agreed." They stepped out into the night together, Clara's quiet life officially left behind in favor of something far more dangerous and infinitely more exciting. The scene in the village square was one of barely controlled panic. Elder Morrison stood at the center of a crowd of frightened villagers, trying to maintain order, while Thomas Brennan and two other men recounted their discovery in the woods. Clara noticed that Thomas seemed significantly more sober now, his earlier belligerence replaced by genuine terror that had burned away any trace of alcohol-induced bravado. As they approached the gathering crowd, Clara could hear fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "Found them in the forest, drained of all color, shadows moving where there should be none." The shadow creatures weren't just being summoned somewhere in the region. They were already here, and people were dying. Clara glanced at Aldrich, seeing her own grim realization reflected in his expression. The research had just become a race against time. "Tell them what you saw," Morrison urged, as Clara and Aldrich approached the edge of the gathering. The elder's usually steady voice carried an undertone of fear that Clara had never heard before. "We was coming back from the tavern in Millhaven," Thomas said, his voice shaking with remembered terror. "Took the forest path, like always. Same route we've used for years, but something was..." The shadows were moving independent, like flowing between the trees, like water instead of staying put where they belonged. "Drunk men see many things," called out Mrs. Ashford, skeptically, though her voice lacked its usual conviction, and Clara could see the worry etched in the lines of her face. "We thought so too," replied one of Thomas's companions, a man named Peters, who worked at the mill. "Figured it was the drink playing tricks on us, until we found the sheep." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd, like a stone dropped in still water. Clara felt Aldric tense beside her, his supernatural senses no doubt picking up details that escaped normal human perception. "What about the sheep?" Morrison asked, though Clara could see he was dreading the answer. "Three of Farmer Brown's flock, missing since yesterday morning," Thomas continued, his voice getting stronger as he found his rhythm but no less frightened. "We found them in a clearing about 2 miles into the woods, but—" He swallowed hard, his face pale in the torchlight. "They was alive, but wrong, empty-looking, like something had drained all the life out of them without actually killing them." Clara felt Aldric's slight intake of breath beside her. This matched the descriptions in several of the historical accounts they had been reviewing. Shadow creatures feeding on life essence, rather than flesh, leaving their victims technically alive, but fundamentally hollow. "And the shadows," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "They were circling the sheep like vultures around Carrion. When we got closer, they turned toward us, had shapes almost like people, but not, like someone had cut person-shaped holes in the world itself." "What did you do?" someone asked from the crowd. "Ran," Thomas admitted, without shame, his earlier swagger completely absent. "Ran faster than I ever have in my life and didn't stop until we reached the village." Elder Morrison looked around the crowd, clearly struggling with how to respond to a situation far outside his experience or authority. "Perhaps we should send word to the county seat? Ask for assistance from—" "From whom?" interrupted Dr. Hayes, the village's physician, his practical nature asserting itself even in the face of the impossible. "Who exactly do we tell? There are drunk troublemakers, saw living shadows in the forest." "But the sheep," began Farmer Brown's wife, her voice tight with worry for both her livestock and the implications of their condition. "Could have been diseased, or poisoned, or any number of natural explanations," Dr. Hayes continued, though Clara could hear the uncertainty beneath his rational protests. Clara watched the debate with growing frustration, her academic knowledge warring with the urgent need for action. She knew from her research that shadow creatures rarely left their victims completely unharmed. The fact that the sheep were still alive suggested they were being used for some purpose rather than simply fed upon. "If I may," Aldrich said, his cultured voice cutting through the argument with quiet authority, "I have some experience with unusual phenomena. Perhaps I could examine the site and provide an informed opinion." The crowd turned toward him, and Clara saw mixed reactions: gratitude for someone willing to take action, suspicion of a stranger involving himself in local affairs, and more than a few calculating looks from unmarried women and their mothers who were already assessing his potential as a match. "That's very kind of you, Lord Ravencrest," Morrison said with obvious relief, eager to have someone else take responsibility for an impossible situation. "But it could be dangerous. I'm quite capable of protecting myself." Aldrich's tone carried quiet confidence that made several villagers nod in agreement, though Clara suspected they had no idea just how capable he truly was. "And Miss Whitmore has offered to accompany me. Her knowledge of local terrain and folklore could prove invaluable." Clara felt a flutter of surprise and gratitude at being included, even as she noticed the sharp looks directed her way from several villagers. The whispers were already starting, and by morning the entire village would be speculating about her relationship with the mysterious stranger. "Miss Whitmore?" Mrs. Ashford's voice dripped disapproval, her tone suggesting that Clara's involvement was both inappropriate and presumptuous. "Surely you don't mean to drag our librarian into such uncertain circumstances." "I hardly think," began Elder Morrison, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of putting Clara in potential danger. "I think," Clara interrupted firmly, finding strength she didn't know she possessed, "that I'm quite capable of making my own decisions about how to spend my time and with whom to spend it." The words came out stronger than she had intended, surprising herself as much as the crowd. She felt Aldric's approving gaze and drew strength from it, standing straighter despite the disapproving stares directed her way. "The library contains extensive records of similar phenomena," she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she stepped into familiar territory. If Lord Ravencrest is willing to investigate this situation, then he deserves access to all available information, and I'm the only one qualified to provide that access and interpretation. But your reputation, Mrs. Ashford began, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when delivering what she considered moral instruction. My reputation, Clara said with newfound steel in her voice, is based on my scholarship and service to this community. I fail to see how contributing my expertise to a matter of village safety could damage either. Thomas stepped forward unexpectedly, his earlier encounter with Clara and Aldric apparently having shifted his perspective dramatically. Miss Whitmore's right to help, if she wants. She knows more about strange happenings than anyone else hereabouts. He looked directly at Clara with something approaching respect. And if she says them old books might have answers, then I say we listen. Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward the man who had insulted her just hours before. Fear, apparently, had a way of clarifying priorities and revealing what truly mattered when survival was at stake. Then, it's settled, Aldrich said, with quiet authority that brooked no further argument. Miss Whitmore and I will examine the site tomorrow at first light. In the meantime, I suggest everyone avoid the forest, particularly after dark. The crowd began to disperse, people clustering in small groups to continue their anxious discussions in hushed voices. As Clara turned to head back to the library, Mrs. Ashford approached with her daughter Margaret in tow, her expression suggesting she had appointed herself the voice of propriety in this unusual situation. Miss Whitmore, she said with false sweetness that barely concealed her disapproval, I do hope you'll be careful. A woman of your circumstances shouldn't put herself in unnecessary danger. Clara was about to respond diplomatically when Aldrich stepped closer, his presence both protective and subtly intimidating, in a way that made Mrs. Ashford take an involuntary step backward. Miss Whitmore's circumstances, he said coolly, his aristocratic accent making each word sound like a judgment, include exceptional courage, extensive knowledge, and remarkable common sense. I consider myself fortunate to have such a capable companion for tomorrow's investigation. Mrs. Ashford's smile became even more strained, her discomfort obvious as she struggled to respond to this firm dismissal of her implied criticisms. Of course, Lord Ravencrest, I simply meant that perhaps a younger, more agile person might be better suited to such activities. Mother, Margaret whispered, clearly embarrassed by her mother's lack of subtlety and the obvious direction of her comments. On the contrary, Aldrich replied smoothly, experience has taught me that intelligence and determination are far more valuable than physical agility when dealing with supernatural phenomena. Miss Whitmore possesses both qualities in abundance, along with specialized knowledge that makes her irreplaceable for this investigation. Clara watched Mrs. Ashford struggle to respond to this firm dismissal of her implied criticisms. The older woman's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration as she realized that her attempt to undermine Clara had not only failed, but had made her look petty and small-minded in front of the very man she had hoped to impress on her daughter's behalf. Finally, Mrs. Ashford managed a tight smile and retreated with Margaret, leaving Clara alone with Aldrich in the emptying square. The torchlight cast dancing shadows around them, and Clara was suddenly very aware of how her life had changed in the space of a single day. Thank you, Clara said quietly, her voice carrying gratitude for more than just his defense of her character. Again, you handled yourself admirably, Aldrich replied, his tone carrying genuine approval. You're stronger than you realize, Miss Whitmore. Today you stood up for yourself, made your own choices, and claimed your right to be part of something important. That takes courage. Clara, she said impulsively, surprised by her own boldness. If we're going to be investigating supernatural phenomena together, perhaps we should use first names. Clara, he repeated, and she liked the way it sounded in his rich voice, spoken with careful attention as if he was tasting the syllables. Shall we return to the library? I'd like to review everything we have about shadow creature behavior before tomorrow. As they walked back across the square, Clara was intensely aware of the curious stares following them. By morning, every person in Thornwick would know that the mysterious stranger had chosen to work with their spinster librarian, and the speculation would be relentless. "You realize," she said quietly, glancing at the windows where candlelight revealed the silhouettes of people watching their passage, "that associating with me will damage your standing with the village's more eligible women." Aldric's laugh was soft but genuine, carrying a warmth that made Clara's heart skip. "Clara, I assure you that I have no interest in the village's eligible women. They lack the qualities I find most attractive, which are intelligence, courage, kindness, and the ability to see beyond surface appearances to deeper truths." He glanced at her sideways, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight, qualities that seem to be in short supply among most people, but which you possess in abundance. Clara felt that familiar warmth blooming in her chest, accompanied by a dangerous flutter of hope that she tried desperately to suppress. It was foolish, she knew, to read too much into his words. He was being kind, nothing more. A sophisticated man, like Aldric Ravencrest, would never seriously consider a woman like her. Would he? Back in the library, they worked late into the night, poring over accounts of shadow creature encounters and mapping locations of reported sightings. Clara found herself stealing glances at Aldric as he read, admiring the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he held books as if they were precious objects, the graceful movements of his pale hands as he turned pages or made notes. The mysterious book that had appeared that morning seemed to glow with inner light in the lamplight, its pages revealing details that grew more specific the longer they studied them. Clara noticed that Aldrich seemed particularly drawn to certain passages, his expression growing darker as he read. "You're troubled by something," Clara observed, setting down her pen and studying his face. "What are you seeing in these texts that I'm missing?" "The methodology described here," Aldrich said slowly, his finger tracing a particularly detailed diagram. "It's not theoretical. Someone has actually performed these rituals, tested these techniques, the level of precision, the attention to detail. This reads like a manual written by someone with extensive practical experience, which means that whoever wrote this book was either directly involved in summoning shadow creatures or witnessed someone who was." His expression grew grim. "And given the age of this text, we're dealing with knowledge that's been passed down through generations." Clara felt a chill as the implications sank in. A tradition of dark magic, rather than a single rogue practitioner. "Exactly. And if this book appeared in your library today, of all days," he met her eyes directly. "Clara, I don't think our meeting was coincidence." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Aldrich suddenly tensed, his head tilting as if listening to something only he could hear. His expression shifted from scholarly concern to immediate alarm. "What is it?" Clara asked, though she was already rising from her chair, some instinct warning her that their time for research had just run out. "They're coming," Aldrich said grimly, moving toward the window with inhuman speed. "The shadow creatures. They're not waiting for dawn." Through the glass, Clara could see chaos erupting in the village square. Dark shapes flowed between the buildings, like living smoke, and people ran in panic, while others stood motionless, their faces blank and lifeless, as if their very souls had been drained away. "What do we do?" Clara asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We stop them," Aldrich replied, and Clara saw something dangerous and inhuman flash in his eyes as his true nature asserted itself. "But first, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no heroic gestures. Promise me." His voice carried the weight of genuine desperation, and Clara realized he was asking her to let him protect her even if it cost him everything. Clara looked at the fear and determination in his face, understanding that he was preparing to risk his existence for her village, for her. The magnitude of what he was offering, and what he was asking in return, took her breath away. "I promise," she said solemnly. "But Aldrich?" "Yes, promise me something in return. Come back to me." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, as if sealing a vow that would bind them across whatever dangers lay ahead. His lips claimed hers with a possessiveness that spoke of feelings too deep for words, and when he pulled away, Clara could see her own desperate hope reflected in his eyes. Always, he whispered against her lips, the word carrying the weight of eternity. Always. Then they stepped out into the night to face whatever darkness had come to claim their village, their newfound love, a bright flame against the encroaching shadows. The scene outside was like something from Clara's worst nightmares, brought to vivid, terrifying life. Shadow creatures flowed through the village streets like animate darkness, their forms shifting between vaguely humanoid shapes and pure, writhing smoke. Some villagers fled in panic, their screams echoing off the stone buildings, while others stood frozen in place, their eyes vacant and their faces slack, as if something essential had been drained from them, leaving only empty shells behind. Life force, Aldric said grimly, confirming Clara's fears as his supernatural senses took in details that escaped human perception. They're feeding on human vitality, leaving the bodies alive, but stealing what makes them truly human. Can they be stopped? Clara asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the chaos unfolding around them. They can be disrupted, scattered, but destroying them permanently requires dealing with whoever is controlling them. Aldric's features shifted slightly in the moonlight, becoming sharper, more predatory, as if the civilized mask he wore was sliding away to reveal something far more dangerous. Clara, I need you to get to the church. It's the most defensible building in the village, and consecrated ground should provide some protection. What about you? I'm going to buy time and try to drive them back. His voice was changing too, gaining undertones that made Clara's skin prickle with awareness of his inhuman nature. Before Clara could argue, Aldric stepped into the chaos with inhuman speed and grace that took her breath away. She watched in fascination and terror as he moved among the shadow creatures, his own supernatural nature finally fully revealed in all its deadly beauty. His hands became claws that could tear through the animated darkness as if it was solid matter, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the creatures recoil as if struck by physical force. He moved like liquid death, faster than human eyes could follow, striking at the shadows with precision and power that spoke of centuries of experience in supernatural combat. But there were so many of them, and more seemed to be emerging from the forest with each passing moment, drawn by some call that only they could hear. Clara made a decision that would have horrified her cautious nature just days before. Instead of fleeing to safety as Aldric had instructed, she ran toward the library, her mind racing with possibilities and half-remembered passages from the texts they had been studying. If these creatures were being summoned and controlled, then someone was using magic that would have historical precedents, and if there were precedents, there might be countermeasures documented in the very books she had spent her life preserving. The library felt different in the darkness, charged with potential energy that made Clara's skin prickle with awareness of forces beyond normal human comprehension. She lit several lamps with shaking hands and went straight to her most restricted collection volumes that she had never shared with casual researchers because their contents were too dangerous or disturbing for untrained minds. Her fingers found the book she needed almost instinctively, as if guided by some deeper knowledge, the Codex of Binding and Banishment, written by a medieval monk who claimed to have witnessed the summoning of entities from beyond the mortal realm. The leather binding was worn smooth by age, and the pages within contained wisdom that most modern minds would dismiss as superstition. Clara flipped through pages of illuminated text and intricate diagrams, searching for anything that might help save her village. The screams from outside seemed to grow more distant as she lost herself in the research, her academic training asserting itself even in the face of supernatural crisis. There, a section on the disruption of shadow summonings, written in the careful Latin of a scholar who had seen too much to doubt the reality of what he recorded. According to the text, shadow creatures required a continuous connection to their summoner to maintain coherence in the physical world. Sever that connection, and they would disperse like smoke in a strong wind, returning to whatever realm had spawned them. But how to sever it? Clara read frantically, aware that every passing moment meant more villagers drained of their life force, more souls lost to the hunger of creatures that should not exist in the world of daylight and ordinary concerns. The answer, when she found it, was both elegantly simple and absolutely terrifying. The connection could be broken by disrupting the summoner's concentration through direct confrontation. Someone had to find whoever was controlling the creatures and force them to stop, either through persuasion, magic, or physical intervention. Clara grabbed the book and ran back outside, dodging panicked villagers and the writhing forms of shadow creatures that seemed to flow around obstacles like living liquid. The air itself felt thick with malevolent energy, and she could taste something metallic and wrong on her tongue. She found Aldric near the village well, his pale skin now marked with dark veins that suggested he was drawing on reserves of power that came with a significant cost. His movements were still fluid and deadly, but Clara could see the strain in his posture, the way he favored his left side, where something had managed to wound him. "Aldric," she called, waving the book as she approached. "I found something." He materialized beside her with vampire speed, his breathing labored despite his supernatural nature. Up close, Clara could see that his eyes had changed, becoming more predatory, more inhuman, as if the battle had stripped away the last pretenses of mortality. "What?" he asked, his voice carrying new harmonics that made her bones vibrate. "The creatures need a continuous link to the summoner. If we can disrupt that connection," Clara began, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency.
"They'll disperse."
Understanding flashed in his transformed eyes. "Clara, you're brilliant, but finding the summoner won't be that difficult," Clara interrupted, pointing toward the forest, with hands that shook only slightly. "Look at the pattern of the creature's movement. They're not random, they're all emanating from a single source." Aldric followed her gaze and saw what her analytical mind had spotted. The shadow creatures were flowing into the village from one specific direction, like water from a broken dam, following invisible channels that led back to their point of origin. "The old stone circle," Clara continued, her academic excitement overriding her fear. "It's mentioned in several historical accounts as a site of power, a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin. If someone wanted to conduct a major summoning, that would be the logical location. Clara, I need you to coordinate the village's defense while we go stop summoner," she corrected firmly, surprising herself with her determination. "Aldric, I know exactly where that stone circle is, and I know the fastest route through the forest. The paths aren't marked on any map. They're deer trails and old hunting routes that I learned as a child. You need me. It's too dangerous." His voice carried genuine anguish at the thought of putting her in harm's way. "It's too dangerous not to bring me." Clara's voice carried new authority, the confidence of a woman who had finally found her true purpose. "Besides, you promised to come back to me. I'm making sure you keep that promise by ensuring you don't go alone." Aldrich stared at her for a moment, and Clara could see him weighing her safety against the practical necessity of her knowledge. Finally, he smiled with what might have been pride, mixed with exasperation. "Very well, but we do this together, or not at all?" "Together," Clara agreed, the word carrying more weight than either of them fully understood. They plunged into the forest, following paths Clara had walked since childhood, but had never traversed for such a purpose. The shadow creatures grew thicker among the trees, drawn to the source of their summoning like iron filings to a magnet. The very air seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and Clara found herself grateful for Aldric's supernatural senses guiding them through the supernatural minefield. "There," Clara whispered, as they approached a clearing where ancient stone stood in a perfect circle. The monument was older than memory, predating even the earliest written records of the region. "Someone's there." A figure in dark robes stood at the center of the circle, arms raised toward the night sky, chanting in a language that hurt to hear. The words seemed to bypass the ears entirely, striking directly at the listener's soul with their wrongness. Around the figure, the air itself seemed to writhe with dark energy, and shadow creatures poured forth like smoke from a chimney, an endless stream of hungry darkness. Marcus Thorn, Aldric said with disgust, recognition clear in his voice. I should have known. You know him? Clara asked, studying the figure with the same analytical attention she applied to her research. A former colleague who chose to pursue power rather than wisdom. He's been trying to bind shadow creatures to his will for decades, growing more desperate and reckless with each failure. Aldric's voice carried the weight of all disappointment and bitter knowledge. And now he's succeeded. Temporarily, Aldric's expression grew grim as he assessed the situation. Clara, this is where you need to trust me and stay back. Marcus won't hesitate to kill you if he sees you as a threat to his working. Then we make sure he doesn't see me coming, Clara replied, surprising herself with her calm determination. Before Aldric could stop her, Clara began moving around the edge of the clearing, using the cover of trees and her intimate knowledge of the local terrain to approach from an unexpected angle. She had spent years feeling invisible. Now she would use that skill to their advantage. From her concealed position, she could see Marcus clearly. He was exactly what she would have expected from a dark sorcerer, pale, gaunt, with eyes that reflected an inner darkness that seemed to devour light. But he was also completely focused on his summoning ritual, vulnerable to disruption if approached correctly. Clara looked around the clearing and spotted something that made her smile grimly. The ancient stones weren't just markers. They were part of the summoning circle itself, carefully positioned to channel and focus mystical energies. If her reading was correct, disturbing their alignment would catastrophically disrupt the entire ritual. She began gathering rocks, grateful for years of physical labor in the library that had given her more strength than most people realized. Her daily routine of moving heavy books and climbing ladders to reach high shelves had built muscle that her loose clothing concealed. When she had collected enough ammunition, Clara stepped into the open, her librarian's training asserting itself even in this surreal situation. Mr. Thorne, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing with the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in public spaces. I believe you're in violation of several local ordinances regarding noise disturbances and unauthorized gatherings. The absurdity of addressing a dark sorcerer with municipal regulations was so unexpected that Marcus actually stopped chanting to stare at her in bewilderment, his concentration broken. The flow of shadow creatures immediately began to waver. Who dares? He began, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone unaccustomed to interruption. Clara's first rock struck one of the ancient stones with enough force to shift it slightly. The summoning circle flickered like a candle in a strong wind, and several shadow creatures began to waver between solid and My name is Clara Whitmore, she announced, hurling another rock with librarian precision born of years of organizing and maintaining her collection. And you are disrupting my village. Marcus raised his hands to redirect his magic toward her, but Aldric chose that moment to attack from the opposite side of the clearing, caught between two threads, and with his concentration shattered, the sorcerer's control over the shadow creatures began to unravel like a tapestry with a pulled thread. Impossible, Marcus snarled, trying desperately to re-establish his ritual while defending against Aldric's supernatural assault. You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. Actually, Clara said with the calm certainty of someone citing established fact, throwing her largest rock at the keystone of the circle, according to the Codex of Binding and Banishment. Disrupting the focal point of a summoning circle will cause immediate dispersal of all conjured entities. The stone shifted with a grinding sound that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself, and the magical energy in the clearing went completely wild. Shadow creatures began dissolving like smoke in a strong wind, their connection to the physical world severed by the destruction of the ritual focus. Marcus let out a scream of rage that contained inhuman harmonics, the sound of a man who had traded too much of his humanity for power. He directed a bolt of dark energy at Clara, the magic crackling through the air like black lightning. She dove aside, but not quickly enough. The magic caught her in the shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground, with pain blazing through her entire body like liquid fire. The world went white, then red, then started to fade at the edges. As shock threatened to claim consciousness, That was when Aldric truly revealed what he was capable of, when someone he loved was threatened. The vampire crossed the clearing faster than human eyes could follow, his fury at seeing Clara hurt transforming him into something terrifying and magnificent. His features became fully inhuman, elongated canines, eyes that glowed with their own light, and an aura of menace that made the very air around him vibrate with barely contained violence. Marcus had time for one startled gasp before Aldric's hand closed around his throat with crushing force. "You hurt her," Aldric said, his voice carrying harmonics of barely contained rage that made the remaining stones in the circle crack. "You hurt the woman I love." Clara, struggling to sit up despite the fire consuming her shoulder, felt her heart skip at those words, even through the pain. He loved her. He had said it aloud, in the heat of battle, when such declarations carried the weight of absolute truth. "She's nothing," Marcus gasped, his voice strangled by Aldric's grip. "A fat village spinster who—" He never finished the insult. Aldric's other hand moved with surgical precision, striking pressure points that Clara hadn't known existed, and Marcus crumpled to the ground, unconscious but breathing. "Clara," Aldric was beside her in an instant, his inhuman features melting back into familiar humanity as concern overwhelmed rage. His gentle touch was such a stark contrast to the violence he had just displayed that Clara felt dizzy from more than just her injury. "I'll live," she managed, though her shoulder felt like it was on fire, and her vision kept threatening to blur around the edges. "Is it over?" "It's over." Aldric helped her stand carefully, his supernatural strength making her weight negligible. "The shadow creatures are dispersed, Marcus is neutralized, and the village is safe." "Good," Clara said, swaying slightly from pain and exhaustion and the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. "Because I think I need to sit down now." Aldric swept her into his arms with effortless strength, and Clara discovered that being carried by someone who cared for you was entirely different from being carried out of necessity. There was tenderness in the way he held her, reverence in his touch that made her feel precious rather than burdensome. "You were incredible," he said, as they walked back toward the village, his voice filled with wonder and pride. "Brave, brilliant, absolutely magnificent. You saved everyone tonight." "I was terrified," Clara admitted, resting her head against his shoulder and breathing in his familiar scent. "But you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." His voice was soft with affection and admiration. "Is that what this feeling is?" Clara asked, surprised by her own lightness, despite the pain. "I thought it was madness." "Perhaps both." Aldric's laugh was soft and warm, carrying joy that transformed his entire demeanor. "Clara, what I said back there about loving you, I meant every word. Even though I'm perfect exactly as you are," he interrupted with gentle firmness. "Strong enough to face down a dark sorcerer, intelligent enough to solve problems that have puzzled scholars for centuries, beautiful enough to take my breath away every time I look at you." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing the enormity of what had happened, not just the magical battle, but the personal transformation she had undergone. In the space of a single night, she had gone from invisible spinster to hero of her own story. "Aldric?" "Yes." "When all this is settled, when the village is back to normal, what happens to us? What do you want to happen?" he asked, though she could hear hope underlying the question. Clara considered seriously. A week ago, her greatest ambition had been to acquire a new collection of poetry books and perhaps organize the folklore section more efficiently. Now she had helped defeat supernatural creatures and fallen in love with a vampire who saw her as beautiful and brave. "I want to keep having adventures with you," she said finally, the words carrying more certainty than she had felt about anything in years. "I want to learn about the world beyond Thornwick. I want to use my skills to help people who face the kinds of threats most don't even believe exist. And I want to show you wonders you've only read about in books," Aldric replied, his voice warm with possibility. "I want to introduce you to scholars and mystics and creatures of legend. I want to love you for as long as you'll have me." "That could be a very long time." "I certainly hope so." As they emerged from the forest, Clara could see the village beginning to return to normal. The shadow creatures had vanished completely, leaving no trace of their presence, except for the memories of those who had witnessed their impossible existence. People were emerging from their hiding places, helping the victims who had been drained of life force but were already beginning to recover their color and vitality. The sight filled Clara with profound relief and a new understanding of her place in the world. She was no longer just the village librarian. She was someone who stood between the ordinary world and the supernatural threats that lurked in its shadows. There would be questions, of course, investigations, official reports that would carefully omit any mention of supernatural phenomena. Clara would help Aldric construct a plausible explanation involving gas leaks and mass hallucinations that the authorities could accept without questioning their fundamental assumptions about reality. But privately, she would know the truth, that she had found her calling as something far more important than a keeper of books. She had found her place as a bridge between the mundane and the magical, between the human world and the supernatural realm that existed in parallel to ordinary existence. And she had found love with someone who valued her mind, cherished her courage, and saw beauty in every curve and quality that made her uniquely herself. Clara, Aldric said as they approached the village square, where people were gathering to help the affected and share their experiences. Yes, thank you.
For what?
For seeing past what I am to who I am. For showing me that intelligence and courage and kindness matter more than supernatural power or aristocratic breeding. For being exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it. Clara smiled, feeling more beautiful and valuable than she ever had in her life. The words that had once defined her, spinster, plain too bookish, too large, seemed to belong to someone else entirely. In their place was a new identity built on accomplishment, courage, and love. Thank you for showing me that I was worthy of love all along, she replied, her voice carrying wonder at the truth of that statement. Always, Aldric said, kissing the top of her head with infinite tenderness. Always. As they entered the square, Clara was surprised by the reception that awaited them. Instead of the suspicious stares and whispered judgments she had expected, she found genuine gratitude and respect. People who had never shown her more than polite tolerance now looked at her with something approaching awe. Miss Whitmore, Elder Morrison approached them, his usual pompous authority replaced by humble gratitude. The villagers, we owe you a debt we can never repay. We all protected our home tonight, Clara replied diplomatically, though she felt a warm glow at the recognition. Everyone did their part. Thomas Brennan stepped forward, his earlier terror replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. Miss Whitmore, we owe you an apology for the things we said, the way we treated you. We were wrong. Clara studied the man who had made her life miserable for years with casual cruelty, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. Fear has a way of clarifying what really matters, doesn't it, Thomas? Yes, ma'am, it surely does. He glanced at Aldric, then back at Clara. If there's ever anything we can do, just remember this feeling, Clara said quietly. Remember that kindness costs nothing, and that everyone has value, even if it's not immediately obvious. As the crowd gradually dispersed, people returning to their homes and families with new appreciation for both safety and each other, Clara found herself alone with Aldric in the square where their adventure had begun. They'll remember this night, Aldric observed, watching the last of the villagers disappear into their houses. Some will, Clara agreed. Others will convince themselves it was something else entirely. People have a remarkable capacity for explaining away what they don't want to believe. And you? Any regrets about having your quiet life disrupted? Clara looked around the square, thinking of her library, waiting for her return, of the books that had been her only companions for so many years. Then she looked at Aldric, at the man who had seen her worth when no one else could, who had defended her honor and claimed her heart. None, she said firmly. I was never really living before you came to Thornwick. I was just existing, waiting for my real life to begin. And now I'm exactly where I belong, with exactly who I belong with. Clara rose on her tiptoes to kiss him softly, marveling at how natural such intimacy had become. I'm finally the woman I was meant to be. You were always that woman, Aldric corrected gently. You just needed someone who could see it. Maybe, but more importantly, I needed to see it myself. The morning light streaming through the windows of Clara's expanded library, now officially designated as the Regional Archive of Supernatural Phenomena, illuminated maps and documents that would have seemed like fantasy to most people. But Clara Whitmore Revenchrist had learned that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than she had ever imagined. She looked up from the correspondence she was reviewing to find Aldric watching her with the same expression of wonder and affection that still made her heart skip. Even after months of marriage, she sometimes couldn't quite believe that this extraordinary man had chosen her, had seen past society's narrow definitions to the woman beneath. The Council of Mystics has approved our proposal, she announced, waving the official letter with satisfaction. They want us to establish similar archives in 3 other regions. Excellent. Aldrich moved around the desk to peer over her shoulder at the documents, his presence still sending pleasant shivers through her despite their familiar intimacy, though it will mean considerable traveling.
I'm looking forward to it.
Clara leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural such casual affection had become.
I spent so many years watching life from windows, Aldric. Now I want to live it fully.
And you will. We both will. Through the window, Clara could see the village going about its daily business. The events of 6 months ago were already becoming legend, with most villagers convinced that the gas leak incident had been a shared hallucination. Only a few, like Thomas Brennan, who had become an unlikely ally, knew the truth. The official story had been carefully crafted to satisfy both the authorities and the villagers' need for rational explanation. Dr. Hayes had written a detailed report about toxic gas emissions from underground deposits, complete with symptoms that matched what people had experienced. The county officials had accepted this explanation gratefully, preferring scientific rationality to supernatural impossibility. But Clara and Aldrich knew the truth, and they had built their new life around protecting others from the darkness that lurked just beyond ordinary perception. Mrs. Ashford stopped by yesterday, Clara said with amusement, remembering the older woman's awkward attempt at conversation. She wanted to know if we were planning to have children soon. What did you tell her? Aldrich asked, though Clara could hear the smile in his voice. That we're quite happy focusing on our work for now. Clara turned in Aldrich's arms to face him, her expression growing more serious, though the question did get me thinking. About what? About the future. About what we're building together. Clara's smile was soft but radiant, carrying the confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. I love our life, Aldrich. I love the work we do, the mysteries we solve, the way we complement each other's strengths. But, he prompted, sensing there was more. But I also love the idea of someday having a family to share it all with. Children who grow up knowing that the world is full of magic and wonder, who learn to see beauty in all its forms. Her voice carried dreams that had seemed impossible just months before. Children who inherit your intelligence and courage, Aldrich said with a smile that transformed his entire face, making him seem less supernatural being and more devoted husband. Who learn from their mother that true worth comes from character rather than appearance. And who learn from their father that being different doesn't make you monstrous, it makes you unique. They were quiet for a moment, both contemplating a future that seemed bright with possibility. Clara had learned that love wasn't just about romance and passion, though she and Aldrich had both in abundance. It was about partnership, about building something meaningful together, about facing whatever challenges arose with united strength. Clara, Aldrich said finally, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that she had learned to treasure. Do you ever regret the choices you've made? The quiet life you gave up? Clara looked around the library that had become so much more than a repository of books. It was now a center of learning, a place where people came to understand the mysteries that existed beyond ordinary experience. She thought of the letters she received from scholars and investigators across the continent, the adventures she and Aldrich shared, the love they had built together, never, she said firmly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. I was never really living before you came to Thornwick. I was just existing, waiting for my real life to begin. And now I'm exactly where I belong, with exactly who I belong with. Clara rose on her tiptoes to kiss him softly, still amazed by the simple miracle of being loved completely. I'm finally the woman I was meant to be. You were always that woman, Aldric corrected gently, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. You just needed someone who could see it.
Maybe, but more importantly, I needed to see it myself.
A knock at the library door interrupted their conversation, bringing them back to the present moment. Clara opened it to find a young woman she didn't recognize, travel-stained, obviously exhausted, but with eyes that held the same desperate hope Clara remembered from her own darkest days. The woman looked to be about 22, with auburn hair escaping from a hastily arranged bun and clothing that spoke of a long, difficult journey. But it was her expression that caught Clara's attention, the particular mixture of fear, determination, and fragile hope that marked someone who had nowhere else to turn. Are you Clara Whitmore Ravencrest? The woman asked, her voice shaking with exhaustion and barely controlled emotion. The one who investigates supernatural phenomena. I am, Clara replied, stepping aside to let the woman enter. The library's warmth seemed to envelop their visitor, and Clara could see some of the tension leave her shoulders as she found herself in what was clearly a place of learning and safety. How can we help you? Clara continued, guiding the woman to a comfortable chair near the fireplace. My village is being terrorized by something that shouldn't exist. The authorities won't listen, and the local clergy think we're all mad or cursed. The woman's voice shook with exhaustion and fear, but underneath Clara could hear core strength that reminded her of her own journey. But I heard that you and your husband help people who face impossible things. Clara felt the familiar thrill of a new mystery, a new opportunity to use her skills to help someone in desperate need. She glanced at Aldric and saw the same excitement reflected in his eyes, the shared purpose that had become one of the foundations of their partnership. Tell us everything, Clara said, settling into her chair with the focused attention that had made her such an effective researcher. Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details, no matter how strange they seem. As the woman began her story, a tale of ancient curses, family secrets, and something hunting in the moors around her isolated village, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been the village's pitied spinster, watching life pass by from behind windows. Now she was part of something larger, something important, something that mattered. She had found her calling, her love, and most importantly, herself. And this was only the beginning. The end. What did you think of Clara's transformation from overlooked librarian to confident supernatural investigator? Her journey proves that our worth isn't defined by others' expectations. It comes from having the courage to embrace who we really are. Drop your thoughts on her evolution in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story inspired you to see your own potential differently, and subscribe for more empowering dark fantasy romances every week.